afternoon. My name is Dr Luke Bayliss. I'm a research assistant with the International Association for Suicide Prevention, and I also work at the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention. Today, I'd like to welcome you to the Partnerships for Life webinar that we are promoting learning on best practices and effective intervention in relation to the implementation of suicide prevention strategies and programs. We have two wonderful speakers here today, the first being Dr Lakshmi Vijayakumar, founder of SNEHA, Head Department of Psychiatry at Chennai, a multi-specialty hospital in Chennai. She's also an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne, Australia, and also on the World Health Organization's International Network for Suicide Research and Prevention. Thank you.
And thank you, Wendy, and the IASP and Partnership for Life for giving me this opportunity to are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make it. Okay. Thank you very much again. So now this decade has seen a phenomenal increase in the number of refugees and displaced persons. We have never seen it in the last so many decades, okay? And now it has really reached a lot of people. And the fact is that almost 30 million refugees are there now. And majority of them are living in difficult circumstances in refugee camps. And the most important thing is 76% of the refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries, which are already struggling with financial, social, and economic infrastructural difficulties. So more than half of the refugees come from just 3 countries: Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. And this has been a changing trend. If you go to the next slide, if you see this, you can see what has been the changing trend of where the refugees are originating from 1995 to 2020. And you can see that the refugees has increased substantially, okay, more than other, even probably internally displaced. There is a lot of internal displacement, but actually refugees has increased enormously. And if you look at it over time, most of them are man-made strifes, wars, civil wars, which has pushed the refugees more than natural calamities. So if you really look at it, see, if you juxtapose natural calamities, it is not there. People are not fleeing their place because of natural calamities, which is also happening quite frequently due to climate change. But the war, the internal war, that has pushed more people out of their homes, out of their communities. So if you look at 1975, it was mostly people from Afghanistan and Ethiopia. Then the next wave, if you really look at it, is 1990, where it is from most of the people from Iraq went to Iran, okay? And then again, immediately in 95, it is the Rwandan genocide, which led to more than 2 million Rwandans going to other countries. And then there was in around 2000, the Serbia and Croatia, about 1,000 people became refugees. And then the big jump came when Syria, from 2010 to 2020, if you look at it, people from Syria constitute almost 25–30% of refugees around the world. So in 2014, 1.7 from Syria. And then, unfortunately, in 2018, in Americas, we never had the much problem of refugees, but the Venezuela crisis, the problem unrest in Venezuela pushed 3.2 million out of Venezuela into various countries. And then, of course, now we are in 2020, we are faced with the biggest refugee people fleeing the country from Ukraine, 5.7 million people leaving Ukraine. So every conflict within the country, every unrest within the country, civilian strife has pushed. And in the last 3 years, Iraq has given a steady number of people. Syria has given a steady number of refugees. But the last, from 2020, it has been refugees from Ukraine and Venezuela. So there is a shifting pattern of refugees from countries. So this is, if you look at this map, you can see that Europe, which had only a small number of people seeking refuge in 2013, and you look at 2022, that's the blue one, which is, I don't know how to use the pointer here. The blue one, if you see 2022, Europe has the maximum people wanting asylum, okay, particularly because of Ukraine. The other thing which we also see is the yellow one. If you look at 2013, there is practically nobody seeking asylum in Latin America or in the Americas. But look at 2022, with the Venezuelan crisis, the number of refugees in the Americas has increased tremendously. So there has been a shifting pattern in global refugee crisis and people wanting asylum. So how is it related to suicide? So all the factors which are associated with being a refugee status are risk factors for suicide. Most of the reason is war, genocide, imprisonment, trauma, violence, and others. And we know all these exposure to violence, trauma has an increased risk for suicide. And then the process of being a refugee, they have to go through hazardous journeys, inhuman conditions, separated from the family, fear of apprehension, of being caught, fear of death, so there is a considerable stress. And then we have what is known as the 7 Ds. After they have reached a place of probably safety, there is discrimination. We call it the 7 Ds. There is discrimination from the host countries. The families are dispersed. And for example, in many places, they have to be, like in Australia, they have to be in detention center. And then their work is being delayed. There is delayed acceptance of asylum processes. So all these makes life intolerable for them and increases the risk for suicide. Further, we do not get absolutely the correct figures of suicide among the refugees because the data are not available. The host countries do not want to give. So there is an accessibility issue. And even collecting data is difficult because even when the refugees are having suicidal thoughts and suicidal attempts, they don't want to reveal it to the camp authorities or the host country health concerns because they feel if they reveal it, then their chances of getting asylum will be thwarted. So there is a huge problem in getting access to data. In spite of that, this is a meta-analysis which clearly shows that suicidal ideation in refugees is significantly present. Okay, and also suicidal attempt. There is only one study from Sweden where they say the suicidal attempt of people in refugee camps is similar to the Swedish population, but the rest of the studies have found that suicide attempts in refugees are higher. And we must also understand that most of these studies are from high-income countries like Sweden, Germany, and all that, where there are better conditions in the refugee camps. We do not have data from where most of the refugees are lodged, which are in low and middle income countries, and the camps and the refugee camps, the status of the camps are really sometimes inhuman. So this, for example, there is this is a suicide-related MMR in the people from Myanmar into Thailand, and you can see when compared to UK, it is 10 times, 15 times more in refugees. And then, of course, we have the Bhutanese refugees in the US, and the biggest challenge for the Bhutanese refugees in the US is that when you, as a man, you're not a provider for the family. What happened in the US is that many of the Bhutanese women are able to find jobs as domestic helps and things like that. And the men have difficulty in finding jobs, and that reduces their purpose, which they, according to the Bhutanese, they have to provide for the family. And when they are not able to, then suicide happens more in the Bhutanese families. Now, these are all, this is the current, which is just published last month, which is about the suicidal ideation and plans and suicide attempts in the 3 Burundi refugee camps in Tanzania. And you can see that, unlike fathers, the persons who are mostly affected more affected are the mothers. The mothers are female, unlike in any other situation where the suicide rate is higher in men. In the refugee population, in low and middle income countries, we have found that the suicide rate is more among women, because the brutality of sexual violence, the difficulty of finding jobs, being intimidated and having to look after the children, and separated from the children. There are many unaccompanied child refugees, and many of the mothers are separated. So it is not surprising that women refugees in low and middle income, refugee camps in low and middle income countries have a higher suicide attempt and rate than men. And so what are the risk factors? This is a very nice study which is done. So what they have found is that when there is more social support, suicide is reduced, okay? But when the mother is exposed to community violence, that is when that area she has been exposed, that is a huge problem. And when there is a large household, because there is always a dispersal of the family. And that is something which the mothers find it very difficult. For the men, those who are higher educated, and when they have to move to a host country where their educational qualifications are not recognized, or they're not able to find jobs in consonance with their ability to or education, then they are at a higher risk of suicide. So I just passed through, but definitely PTSD, somatoform disorders. And what we need to know, what we need to understand is that 45% of refugees in the world are children, okay? And they have difficulty in identifying psychological issues in children. But what has been found is almost 11% of the children start developing nocturnal illnesses, which is a sign of stress and anxiety. So children who were toilet trained and completely fine, so during the refugee status, during the process, living in refugee camps, they all develop, most of them develop, quite a sizable amount of them develop nocturnal enuresis, which is passing, I know what it is. So, which is more important? Well, and many of the women in refugee camps face violence. They face violence from their spouses and also from others. And because in refugee camps, intolerable situations, many of them resort to alcoholism. So the alcoholism fuels the IPV and suicide ideation increases. Okay. When there is no victimization in a refugee camp, then there is no suicidal ideation. But when there is victimization and intimate partner violence, it's almost 50% of the women who have suicidal ideation. Okay. So is there a time when suicide happens? Okay. Majority of the suicide happens in the first 6 months of their refugee status. Okay, when they are still unable to reconcile to the fact that they are not in their home place, they are struggling with a new place, new country, and the new lifestyle, that is when. The next peak period when suicide happens is when there is a long waiting period. When they have been in a camp for more than 18 months, 1.5 years, 2 years, waiting, hoping against hope that someday will get a residency permit, or they will be going to another country or something like that, and that doesn't happen, then people lose hope. And most of the time, and definitely the biggest thing happens when their asylum is rejected and when they have to be repatriated. And then this is also interesting. The kind of trauma they have undergone also seems to be linked to the method of suicide. For example, if they had been forced to blunt force, then majority of the people resort to jumping. And if they had been exposed to water torture, then the suicides happens by drowning. And if somebody had hit them with knives and things like that, then the same thing happens. So there seems to be a kind of a connection between the kind of torture which they undergo and the kind of method which they choose. So again, as I said, female in the reproductive age group and who are separated or single, and all these countries, they are at a high risk. And this is unaccompanied children. Okay, these unaccompanied children, as I said, there are about at least 40% of refugees are children, and of them, at least 3-4% of them are unaccompanied children. They have really no one, they are left adrift in this world, and they have really high suicidal ideation, really high suicidal situation as young as 7, 8, 10, and so on. Okay. And what has been found in South Sudanese refugees is violence has become normal for them. And that normalized violence causes more suicidal thought. It is a fact of life that anyone can come into your group at any time and do whatever they want. So that violence as a part of your daily life increases suicidal behavior, not surprisingly. So this is among suicidal ideation among women. And what you can find out from this, I mean, this is in a good place, Sweden, where there is, the refugee camps are better, there is better infrastructure and so on. But again, where it acts is, I mean, of course, depression, anxiety, and PTSD have a strong correlation to suicidal. But also what we need to understand is, again, the young people, 18 to 25, young women, okay? That is a major cause for concern. So if you have to look at what are the various risk factors which causes suicide for a refugee is, apart from the socio-demographic factors and psychological factors and personal factors, what are the kind of pre-migration difficulties they have had? And what are the kind of post-migration difficulties they have? These are significant factors in producing suicide risk. So we did a small study in the Sri Lankan refugee camps in Tamil Nadu. This is Sri Lanka, and these north and the eastern part of Sri Lanka, there are a lot of Tamils. And because of the conflict between the Sinhalese and the Tamils, there have been 2-3 waves of Tamils moving from the Sri Lanka to Tamil Nadu, which is where I reside, which is the coast, where in a boat, you can reach in about an hour or so from the northernmost tip of Sri Lanka. So we've had 2-3 waves, and we have more than 100,000 Sri Lankan refugees living in refugee camps. And they came up, and the UNHCR came up and said, we are very worried because the suicide rate in our camps are extremely high. So you need to do something about it. So what we did was, we had an intervention site and we had a control site. We took refugee camp where there are more than 1,000 people, and there were 20, and by lot we selected one as an intervention and one as a control. And we screened everybody. The screening was done by a different agency. The screening, we screened everybody above 80. Okay. So we found that the assessments were done, and those who scored over 60 in depression rating scale, over 30 in PTSD, and those who have had previous suicide attempt, we identified as high risk. So we identified 288 in the intervention village and 187 in the control village as high risk people. And just to give you an idea, there was really no difference between the intervention village and the control village in terms of the kind of exposure to war or loss or during migration between the two groups. Okay, they had similar kind of, there was no statistical difference between the two groups. So then we have great difficulty in getting into the camp because it is not easy to get into a refugee camp and do an intervention. So we have to do a lot of political maneuvering and media maneuvering to be allowed to get in. And so we, because we didn't have, and another major challenge is when you want to work with the refugees is you don't get funding opportunities are very rare. So we did it from our own funding. So we selected 15 people from the refugee camp, trained them on visiting the people who are at high risk, offering emotional support, and then added safety. I taught them also safety planning. So we call this as CASP, community contact and safety planning. So this was the simple thing, easily doable, scalable, and can easily train. It can be easily trained and scaled up. So this is a safety planning card which we developed, and then these community volunteers visited the high-risk people once in 15 days for 1 year. At the end of 1 year, we again asked the external agency to evaluate them in terms of depression, anxiety, and suicide. And you can see definitely that when you looked at it in the intervention group, the suicide rate has come down drastically, okay, compared to the control side. This is a very simple intervention. But slowly now people are realizing the importance of this amongst the refugees. So this is from NIH. They have started looking at how to do refugee camps. And this is the intervention. The journal has brought out a special issue in 2021 on the World Suicide Prevention Day on suicide amongst refugees, which is a very valuable, particularly focusing on Middle East refugees, which is a very valuable document. And the UNHCR, based on our work, has brought out a toolkit. And now I am happy to say CASP has been introduced in many refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan to do this. So UNHCR just this year has brought out a toolkit on how to prevent suicide in the refugee settings. So if I have to wind up, because I can see Luke looking at the watch, so I'll just wind up. see, for every risk factor, we have an intervention. Okay. So universal interventions are important. Particularly, we need to focus on the media. Every host media reports refugees as a burden on the economy, burden on the country. So we need to work with the media to change the narrative about that. Okay. So for the individual, the community level, one of the most important thing is we have to teach them the language of the host country as early as possible. Okay. And provision for economic activity. We have found that language and economic activity has greater mitigating effect than anything else. And also importantly is to see that the families and clans are kept in the same refugee camp. Sometimes the father is in one camp, the mother is in one camp, child is in another camp. So more effort to see that that is done. And also a lot of education about prevention of alcohol and domestic intimate partner violence is necessary. Okay. At the individual level, of course, it is like providing support, mental health services. And as I said, if not anything else, at least finding some people from the camp to act as lay counselors and support givers so that they can facilitate the entry of people who need mental health support to other people. So what really seems impossible is not really always so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you very much. It was a comprehensive presentation and helped us all greater understand suicidality among refugees and the compounding challenges that they face. There is a question from Kat Witt, which we've noted, but for time's purposes, we'll take that to after Kairi's presentation. And just to let everyone know, please put your questions in the chat, and if we run out of time today, we will email the questions through to the presenters for them to respond to later. Thank you, Lakshmi. And our second presenter, cheers. Our second presenter is Professor Kairi, who works at the Australian Institute of Suicide Research and Prevention. Is also the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Research and Training in Suicide Prevention at Griffith University. Kairi's presentation is titled Climate Change and Suicidality. And Kairi, you should be good to start sharing your screen now. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much to YASP for inviting me to do this presentation on a very important and rather relatively new topic in the context of suicidal behaviors and suicidality more widely. And thank you, Luke, for the nice introduction. So, firstly, as already noted, it is a rather new topic. In particular, not in its wider terms when we are talking about climate change, but specifically in terms of suicide and self-harm. And when we look at the different, for example, different overarching reviews or seminars published in Lancet, for example, then the first time when we note climate change being noted in the context of suicide and self-harm was just recently in by Knipp and colleagues in 2022. And it was noted that it is another key global risk factor for suicide, and it is becoming increasingly important. And yes, that is quite true. And I will be able, considering my presentation is rather short, considering the time frame, I will be able to dive a slight bit deeper and give an overview using the existing literature, mainly on the environmental factors, better extremes, and Eka mentions in their link to suicidality. So firstly, what is climate change might be the question. And understandably, I am not an expert in climate change myself, and I don't expect many of you being either, as we are targeting mainly suicidal behaviors and suicide prevention. So therefore, I'm using United Nations definition here from their webpage, and everybody can obviously dive more into the context of what is climate change, what are the different theories, and of course, as we know, there are so many controversies around it. So in very wide terms, climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. And it has been noted that since 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of this climate change. And in a nutshell, burning fossil fuels generate greenhouse gas emissions, which then act like a blanket around the Earth, which will raise the temperature. So, and this may lead to different types of weather, extreme weather events, for example, which often referred in the literature as weather extremes. So when we are talking about climate change in the context of mental health, there is quite a lot of literature appearing around it, particularly in the last decade, and it has been raised quite a lot. Here I'm using a figure by Lawrence, where the top part refers really what we consider as climate change. So we are talking about increasing global temperatures, but also what I noted already, weather extremes, such as, for example, floods, wildfires, heat waves, etc. So they do have immediate direct impacts. Here can be loss of life, loss of damage to nature, agriculture, includes pollution. They further have longer term impacts, indirect impacts, and through those, but also more directly from immediate direct impacts, are the impacts to our mental health, emotional well-being. Here, there is also note on suicide. The note on suicide mainly comes from the studies around the temperature. So I personally would lead suicide as a separately here, but of course, similarly, it is impacted by longer-term direct impacts, but also individual impacts and mental health and emotional well-being, leading to the possibility of suicidal ideation and behaviors. So now, what I have been mainly looking more recently in the context of climate change is different environmental factors, such as with the main focus on meteorological factors, weather extremes here, when the weather extremes lead to the disasters, and eco-emissions. They come kind of in a scale of being more on ecological level and more on the dimension of ecological and individual level. So on that depends also our ability to analyze them, which is quite challenging in itself. So there is a possibility this leading to suicidal ideation and behavior, as I noted, but of course it's not way that simple, and of course there are multiple confounding factors and contributing factors, also again both from the ecological aggregated level, but also from the individual level. So now, considering limited time I have today, I will start with the most analyzed and studied part, which is temperature and suicidal behaviors. There have been a few systematic literature reviews with some differences when it comes to the what kind of factors are considered, what type of temperature. But the most I'm using here, just the most important one by Frangioni from 2022. Their literature gathers all the literature on the temperature used until mid 2021. So I will start with the temperature, but their paper did also include some other meteorological factors, but only for the temperature, where in total they identified 29 papers, and then 26 were included temperature, which they were able to analyze in the frames of a meta-analysis. And they found a positive association, so that increase of 1 degree in the average temperature will increase suicidal behaviors. Here I mean suicide and suicide attempts by 1.6%. So they did also, considering the diversity of the results, they did also analyze subgroups and found, for example, that suicide mortality was more strongly associated with the temperature compared to the suicide attempts. They found also that the male suicidality was more strongly associated with the temperature than female one. But also, interestingly, there were differences, of course, or there were differences across the different regions, and they found that in particularly the strongest association was in East Asia and in Pacific. So our territory or our region is particularly impacted. So they did look also other meteorological variables. However, the number of studies here is very limited, and there was no meta-analysis conducted. However, solar radiation and cloud coverage did show, in general, some association in the papers they looked at. Now jump to the weather extremes, and talking here about the disasters and suicidality. There is no analysis as such, or no literature review focusing on weather extremes and suicidality. However, we have to consider that not all natural disasters aren't necessarily weather extremes, and weather extremes as such may turn into a disaster when we consider the vulnerabilities and their coverage. So whether they impact people, where they land, etc. So, and we have to consider, for example, that when we are talking about natural disasters, which I do next, it does not that it does include earthquakes when we are talking about natural disasters, while weather extreme natural disaster is not a weather extreme, despite it has been noted that climate change may impact some secondary triggers related with earthquakes. However, based on our previous systematic literature review and current update on natural disasters, and many, more than half of papers include earthquakes. And as you can see, based on the numbers in the first paper, which included all papers before 2011, there were 42 relevant papers, while in the last decade, there has been a notable increase in the number of papers related with the topic of natural disasters. However, I have to note here again, like there is lots about earthquakes, lots about earthquake impact in Japan particularly. And it's very, very hard. Both of the reviews have concluded that it's very hard to make any certain conclusions considering the diversity of different study designs, the difficulty, obviously, to design prospective studies, considering the unpredictability of the natural disasters, understandably. And also multiple different outcome measures and methodologies used. It's really hard to say a definitive answer here. However, in general, what we can say is that there were inconsistencies in the findings, particularly for suicide mortality. There appears to be an increase in suicide mortality following drought. However, there is no evidence, for example, for hurricanes and floods when we are talking about weather extremes more specifically. And of course, it may depend on the different types of contexts, which I won't have time at the moment to go into details. Now, when it comes to the disasters and suicidal ideation and non-fatal suicidal behaviors, there seems to be some discrepancy between two reviews. More specifically, the recent one concluded that exposure to droughts, hurricanes, and tsunamis, and other disasters is associated with increased risk of suicidal ideation and non-fatal suicidal behaviors, which was somewhat different considering our previous research or previous systematic literature review, where we concluded that there seemed to be initial honeymoon effect, and then and pulling together, or what is referred to pulling together phenomenon, which was later followed by increase. I don't think personally that it is a contradiction. It's just that in the second systematic literature review, there were just no studies which would analyze that early stages after the natural disaster to make any noticeable note on this honeymoon period. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist. Now, jumping into another more individual level topic, which is a rather recent for many of us, and that's kind of the individual impact of climate change. And here there are new terms with like eco-emissions, and in the literature there is a growing number of noting different types of eco-emissions. Currently, the most spoken about and most described are eco-anxiety, eco-grief, and solastalgia. And here I have the definitions for those most common ones. Sorry, I will not have really time into going to details about the nature of them. So if interested, please contact. And also we are currently we have just updated our eco-emissions and suicidal ideation and behaviors related systematic literature review. And there is a preprint. You can see all this terminology there. However, the results there are now somewhat outdated, considering initially when we ran the searches, we identified only one paper, which was also published only in 2023. And actually, it was even not quite directly related with the suicidality, in the meaning that it didn't analyze specifically the association between eco-emotions and suicidality, but it was more about perceptions of the mental health experts, if they have seen people who have been suicidal because of climate change related worries, which was actually 1/5 in the US. So 1/5 of the participants, mental health professionals, responded that yes, they have actually an experience that their clients have experienced suicidality related with climate change worries. So, and of course, with the eco-emotions being so new terms, there is a lot of controversy there still, and the definitions are still kind of diverse, and there are different new scales developed around it. Anyhow, our just very, very recent update, we now identified 5 papers. So which means that between September and July, there were already 4 new papers on topic. So as you can understand, it's a very fresh topic, and the research is into suicidality also is going in there. So we identified now 5 papers. 3 of them were cross-sectional studies. 1 was case report and the qualitative study. So based on the trend of like what types of studies, you can imagine that it's really the beginning of the research in the field. They came from the different countries, and the target groups, they're very different. However, only 2 studies specifically analyzed the association between eco-emotions and suicidality. One was found a significant association between climate change worry and suicide plans and attempts in high school students in Kenya, and the other one was found association between environmental worry and suicidal ideation among adults in Mexico. So, but you have to be cautious. They have multiple, but they are not very strong studies from research in research terms. So now to conclude my presentation, where to work from here, and I will base my kind of conclusions or recommendations based on, again, on the paper by Lawrence, who gave a few implications for policy and practice in the context of climate change and mental health. And I do agree with many of them, or majority of them, overlapping really. And for example, I would like to highlight here particularly for example, the first one, which is advocacy. And here, actually, Professor David Lester, already a few years ago now, noted in an editorial in Crisis that also suicidology and suicide prevention organizations should consider making public position statements considering the importance of policies for improving the climate and how it does potentially also impact suicidality. And he specifically, for example, mentioned also AISRAP. And other point, definitely moving towards interventions direction. And here there was a recent systematic literature review. However, this including more widely disasters and public health emergencies. And this included actually only 1 study, which was related with weather extremes, which was by our previous speaker, Lakshmi. And then lastly, we need more research. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, Kairi, for that wonderful presentation. And very timely, as the World Health Organization has now called for mental health strategies and the wider, by extension, suicide prevention strategies to integrate climate change as new strategies are developed. We do have one question from Mohammed. I'll just read it out, and we've got a little bit of time for you to answer that, please. Women in Bangladesh are more at risk of suicide. Incidents like suicide are mainly due to social instability, strife, personal instability, family trust, political anarchy, economic crisis, extreme inequality, unemployment, etc. How could climate change potentially be related to this?
Well, we have to consider climate change impacts us on very, very wide level. For example, unemployment. For example, food. These are all the factors by the climate change. Now, when we consider weather extremes are also likely to impact, particularly the Western Pacific region, and these two impact they do impact your employment. They do impact our families' well-being, ability to work, but also very importantly, food, etc. So they do have overarching impact. Plus, also like growing temperature, which may impact us on multiple different levels. So, but yes, there are of course some aspects which may not seem to be very immediately obvious, considering we are living inside it. We are living inside that climate change. Of course, there are, like, as I noted, it's a controversial topic, and there are different views on the climate change. And I'm not aiming to argue on that topic, but yes, of course, there are different theories around the climate change as such.
Great, thank you very much for that well thought out answer. And as we move forward in time, and climate change, you know, as predicted, is to ramp up, and the first line of defense, or the first potential people who are going to suffer quicker than others, are people in the Western Pacific and the Southeast Asia region, which we're quite well represented here. So thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kairi. We've got a couple of minutes spare if anyone else had some questions they wanted to pop into the chat. And as anyone likes to pop in their questions, I'd also like to take this time to, on behalf of the International Association for Suicide Prevention, to thank our two presenters, Professor Kairi Kõlves and Professor Lakshmi. Just want to make sure I get your surname correct, Lakshmi. Dr. Professor Lakshmi Vijayakumar from SNEHA. I see we don't have any further questions. If you would like the presenters' email in case a question comes to mind, by all means, feel free to contact our team at the International Association for Suicide Prevention. But I think Rex has his hand up. Rex, would you like to take the microphone, please?
Again, Luke.
Yes, welcome, Rex. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Luke. Yeah, thank you very much for the two presentations. And the one with the climate change is the one we resonate with, especially in our islands that we, due to climate change and change of weather and the impacts of the climate change. So, yeah, it's something that we can explore to see more of, mental health problem associated with depressions, anxiety, and suicide. There was a study done as well. There's a small study done at some of the coastal areas, and there's an increase of anxiety among people in the Solomon Island, close to the, and probably we can also find out suicide cases as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rex, for that comment and insight into a little bit of research that's been undertaken in the Solomon Islands. Lakshmi, would you like to speak?
No,
please?
I just wanted to answer to Dr. Mohammed's question earlier, which I didn't answer. And he's right. There are a lot of refugees in Bangladesh also, Rohingya refugees, which is also a problem. But I have some statistics about Rohingya refugees, but I didn't want to. I was already over the time limit, so I didn't. But as I said, these are the situations where, host countries, most of them, the refugees go to the neighboring country, which have a similar, probably another low socioeconomic country, middle income countries, which is already burdened with their own mental, and economic difficulties. So we need to have a real strategy how low and middle income countries can cope with refugees from neighboring countries.
It's a very good point. Thank you, Lakshmi. And we've just got one final question from Anita, who has their hand up. Please go ahead, Anita.
Hi, am I unmuted? I can't tell.
We can hear you, yes, thanks.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, it was really just an observation. I worked in Papua New Guinea for a few years, and what was happening was tidal surges and salination of gardens and no longer being able to produce food was creating a pressure cooker because people, communities couldn't move further backwards because they'd have been moving on to another tribal land, which can result in tribal warfare. And sometimes provincial governments were then just transplanting coastal communities up into mountain regions with which they're completely unfamiliar. And in terms of everything, spirituality, access to foods, lifestyle connection, etc. So I think part of the problem with climate change and suicidality is going to be the dislocation, and it's already happening. And it hasn't been understood or solved, I think, by a lot of Western nations who see it as something in the future. That was all. It was more of a comment to say that there's some significant risk factors, both for tribal disruption into tribal war and the depression and loss of being moved to lands that are simply untenable in terms of generations of experience.
Yes, that's very insightful, Anita.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's something that perhaps Western governments haven't considered yet either, without having a great understanding of what happens in other countries where that is happening. Right, the future is now; it's happening. Yes, as you well pointed out. Thank you. It's right on the hour, wherever you're tuning in from. So I'd just again like to thank the presenters for joining us. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, whether you're here now or watching the recording. And stay tuned for the next webinar coming up within the Partnerships for Life program. Thank you very much.